Chapter 3. Who's the Fattiest? Finally, the big day came. Joe took off his diamond-encrusted watch and put his gold pen in the drawer. He looked at the designer black snakeskin bag that his dad had bought him for his first day at his new school and put it back in his cupboard. Even the bag that the bag had come in was too posh, but he found an old plastic one in the kitchen and put his schoolbooks in that. Joe was determined not to stand out. From the back seat of his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, he had passed the local comprehensive many times on his way to St Cuthbert's, and he'd seen the kids pouring out of the school, a rushing river of swinging bags and swear words and hair gel. Today, he was going to enter the gates for the first time, but he didn't want to arrive by Rolls-Royce. That would be a pretty good hint to the other kids that he was rich. He instructed the chauffeur to drop him off at a nearby bus stop. It had been quite a few years since he travelled by public transport, and as he waited at the bus stop, Joe tingled with excitement. "I can't change that," said the bus driver. Joe hadn't realised that a £50 note was not going to be welcome to pay for a £2 bus fare, and he had to get off the bus. Sighing, he began to walk the 2 miles to school, his flabby thighs rubbing together as he took each step. Finally, Joe reached the school gates. For a moment, he loitered nervously outside. He had spent so long living a life of wealth and privilege. How on earth was he going to fit in with these kids? Joe took a deep breath and he marched across the playground. At registration, there was only one other kid sitting on his own. Joe looked over at him. He was fat, just like Joe, with a mop of curly hair. When he saw Joe looking at him, he smiled, and when registration was finished, he came over. "I'm Bob," said the fat boy. "Hi, Bob," replied Joe. The bell had just rung, and they waddled along the corridor to the first lesson of the day. "I'm Joe," he added. It was weird to be in school where no one knew who he was. He wasn't the bum boy, or billionaire bum, or the bum-fresh kid. "I'm glad you're here, Joe. In the class, I mean." "Why is that?" asked Joe. He was excited. It looked as though he might have found his first friend already. "Because I'm not the fattest boy in the school anymore," Bob said confidently, as if stating an independently verified fact. Joe scowled, then stopped for a second and studied Bob. It looked to him like he and the other boy were just about the same level of fattiness. "How much do you weigh, then?" demanded Joe grumpily. "Well, how much do you weigh?" said Bob. "Well, I asked you first." Bob paused for a second. "About 8 stone." "I'm 7 stone, said Joe, lying. "No way are you 7 stone, said Bob angrily. "I'm 12 stone, and you're much fatter than me." "You just said you were 8 stone, said Joe accusingly. "I was 8 stone, replied Bob, "when I was a baby." That afternoon it was cross-country running. What a dreadful ordeal for any day at school, not least your first day. It was a yearly torture that seemed designed solely to humiliate those kids who weren't sporty. A category Bob and Joe could definitely be squeezed into. "Where is your running kit, Bob?" shouted Mr. Bruce, the sadistic PE teacher, as Bob made his way onto the playing field. Bob was wearing his wife runs and a vest, and his appearance was greeted by a huge wave of laughter from the other kids. "Someone must have hidden it, sir," answered a shivering Bob. "Likely story," scoffed Mr. Bruce. Like most PE teachers, it was difficult to imagine him wearing anything other than a tracksuit. Do I still have to do the run, sir?" asked a hopeful Bob. "Oh, yes, boy. You don't get off that easily. Right, everyone, on your marks. Get set. Wait for it. Go!" At first, Joe and Bob sprinted away like all the other kids, but after about 3 seconds, they were both out of breath and were forced to walk. Soon, everyone else had disappeared into the distance, and the 2 fat boys were left alone. "I come last every year," said Bob, unwrapping a Snickers and taking a large bite. "All the other kids always laugh at me. They get showered and dressed and wait at the finish line. They could all go home, but instead they just wait to jeer at me." Joe frowned. That didn't sound like fun. He decided he didn't want to be last and quickened his pace a little, making sure he was at least half a step ahead of Bob. Bob glared at him and piled on the speed, going up at least half a mile an hour. From the determined expression on his face, Joe knew that Bob was hoping that this year was his golden chance not to finish last. Joe sped up a little more. They were now almost jogging. The race was on for the ultimate prize. Who was going to finish second to last? Joe really didn't want to be beaten at cross country, running by a fat boy in his vest and pants on his first day at school. After what seemed like an eternity, the finish line hazed into sight. Both boys were out of breath with all the power waddling. Suddenly, disaster struck Joe. A painful stitch burst in his side. "Ow!" cried Joe. "What's the matter?" asked Bob, now quite a few centimetres in the lead. "I've got a stitch. I've got to stop. Ow!" "You're bluffing. A 15-stone girl pulled that on me last year and ended up beating me by a fraction of a second." "Oh, it's true," said Joe, holding his side tightly. "I ain't falling for it, Joe. You're going to be last, and this year all the kids in the year are going to be laughing at you," said Bob triumphantly, as he edged ahead still further. Being laughed at on his first day at school was the last thing that Joe wanted. He'd had enough of being laughed at when he was at St. Cuthbert's. However, that stitch was becoming more and more painful with every step. It was as if it was burning a hole in his side. "How about I give you a fiver to come last?" he said. "No way," replied Bob, through heaving breaths. "A tenner?" "No. 20 quid. Try harder. 50 quid. Bob stopped and looked around at Joe. 50 quid, he said. "That's a lot of chocolate." "Yeah," said Joe. "Tons. You've got yourself a deal, but I want the wonga now." Joe searched through his shorts and pulled out a £50 note. "What's that?" asked Bob. "It's a £50 note. I've never seen one before. Where did you get it?" "Oh, it was my birthday last week, you see," said Joe, stumbling over his words a little, "and my dad gave it to me as a present." The marginally fatter boy studied it for a moment, holding it up to the light as if it was a priceless artefact. "Wow, your dad must be loaded," he said. The truth would have blown Bob's fat mind that Mr. Spud had given his son £2 million as a birthday present, so Joe kept stum. "Nah, not really," he said. "Go on then," said Bob. "I'll come last again. For 50 quid, I would finish tomorrow if you like." "Just a few paces behind me will be fine," said Joe. "Then it will look real." Joe edged ahead, still gripping his side in pain. Hundreds of little, cruelly smiling faces were coming into focus now. The new boy crossed the line with only a hum of mocking laughter. Trailing behind was Bob, clutching his £50 note, since there was no pockets in his Y-fronts. As he neared the finish line, kids started chanting, "Blob, blob, 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 blob," and the chants grew louder and louder. "Blob, blob, 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 blob." They started clapping in time now. "Blob, blob, blob, blob." Undeterred, Bob hurled his body across the finish line. "Ha ha 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 ha!" The other kids fell around laughing, pointing at Bob. He bent over and panted for breath. Turning around, Joe felt a sudden twinge of guilt. As the school kids dispersed, he went over to Bob and helped him stand up straight. "Thanks," said Joe. "You're welcome," said Bob. "To be honest, I should have done that anyway. If you came last on your very first day, you'd never hear the end of it. But next year, you're on your own. I don't care if you give me £1 million. I ain't coming last again." Joe thought about his £2 million birthday cheque. "What about £2 million?" he joked. "Deal," said Bob, laughing. "Imagine if you really did have that much money. It would be crazy. I guess you could have everything you wanted." Joe forced a smile. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe."